Alright, so first you add the root 2 to the other side, so then you get 3 root 2 cosecant squared theta equals 4 root 2. Then you have to divide the whole thing by 3 root 2 in order to get the cosecant by itself, the cosecant squared by itself. And then you get 4 root 2, 3, root 2, and then the root 2's cancel out, so then you're left with cosecant squared of theta equals 4 over 3. And then you have to square root the whole thing to cancel out the square, so then you get cosecant of theta equals 2 over root 3. And cosecant is 1 over cosine, so then, or 1 over sine, so then sine theta equals root 3 over 2. It's also plus or minus. So then on your circle, you have root 3 over 2, which is 60. So it's a 60-degree angle, which is then pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 3, 7 pi over 3, all plus 2 pi n. And those are your answers, since there is no domain restriction. So first you have to subtract 3 to the other side, so you get 8 sine squared of theta equals 2. And then you divide by 8, so then you get sine squared of theta equals 2 over 8. And then if you reduce that, then you get sine squared of theta equals 1/4. And then you take the square root to cancel out the squared. So then you get sine theta equals plus or minus 1 over root 2. And then in order to make this a legal fraction, you have to multiply it by root 2 over 2, because it's a fancy form of 1. So you get sine theta equals plus or minus root 2 over 2. So then, on your circle, you get, this is a root 2 over 2 is a 45-degree angle. So then you get pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. And since there's a domain restriction, you don't add the 2 pi n to your answer. To do this one, to start off, we have to divide by 2 root 3 in order to get the secant squared by itself. So then you get secant squared of theta equals 4 root 3 over 2 root 3. And the root 3's would cancel each other out, and the 4 over 2 would reduce to 2 on top by itself, so that'd be secant squared theta equals 2. Then you have to take the square root of that, so that you can get secant theta equals root 2. And secant is 1 over cosine, so then it'd be cosine of theta equals 1 over root 2. And then you have to multiply it by root 2 over root 2 in order to make it legal. So then you get cosine. Also, it's all plus or minus. So then you would get root 2 over 2. So it's a 45-degree angle, so then on your circle, you have the 45s, which then gives you pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. And since there's a domain restriction, you don't add plus 2 pi n to your answer. So first, for this one, you'd have to subtract the 2 root 3 to the other side, so then you get root 3 tangent squared theta equals root 3. Then you'd have to divide by root 3 in order to get the tangent squared by itself, so then you get tangent squared theta equals 1. Then you have to square root that, so then you get tangent theta equals plus or minus 1. And tangent is sine over cosine. So in order for that to equal 1, it would have to be the same fraction on the top. So then you would get tangent of theta equals plus or minus root 2 over 2 over root 2 over 2. So then, on your circle, these are all 45-degree angles, so it would be, and your answers would be pi over 4 plus 2 pi n, since there's no domain restriction. 3 pi over 4 plus 2 pi n. 5 pi over 4 plus 2 pi n. 7 pi over 4 plus 2 pi n are your answers. So for this one, to start off, you have to add 5 root 2 to the other side. So you go. And then you have to divide by 6 root 2 in order to get the secant squared by itself. So then you would get secant squared of theta equals 8 root 2 over 6 root 2. And then the root 2's cancel each other out. And then the 8 over 6 reduces to square 4 over 3. And then you have to square root it in order to get rid of the squares. So you get secant equals 2 over root 3. And then secant is 1 over cosine, so then you get cosine of theta equals root 3 over 2. And all of this is plus or minus because of the square. So then, on your unit circle, cosine root 3 over 2 is 30-degree angle. So that means your answers are pi over 6 plus 2 pi n, 5 pi over 6 plus 2 pi n, 7 pi over 6 plus 2 pi n, and 11 pi over 6 plus 2 pi n. And those are your answers. To do this one, you first have to add 8 to the other side, so then you have 10 sine squared of theta equals 5. And then you'd have to divide by 10 to get the sine squared by itself, and so then you'd get 1/2. Then you have to square root it, so then you get sine of theta equals 1 over root 2. In order to make it legal, you'd have to multiply it by root 2 over root 2, because it's a fancy form of 1. And then you get sine of theta equals root 2 over 2. And then, on the unit circle, that would be 45-degree angles. So then you have pi over 4, and since there's a domain restriction, you don't add the 2 pi n. You'd also have 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and those are your answers. For this one, you'd first subtract 2 root 3 to the other side, so then you get root 3 cotangent squared of theta equals 3 root 3. And then you would have to divide by root 3, so you get cotangent squared of theta equals 3 root 3 divided by root 3. So then the root 3's cancels. You get cotangent squared of theta equals 3. Then you have to square root that, so then you would get cotangent of theta equals square root of 3 over 1, because cotangent is cosine over sine. So that means it has to be root 3 over 2 over 1 over 1/2. So then you would have on your unit circle, (30-degree angles, because cosine is also plus or minus because of the square root. Because cosine is 1/2, so that means the opposite angle of that has to be 30 degrees. But since there's a domain restriction, cross off the top. So then that only leaves you with 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. No 2 pi n because of the domain restriction. First, for this one, you'd add root 2 to the other side, so you have 3 root 2 secant squared of theta equals 3 root 2. And then you have to divide by 3 root 2, so you get secant squared of theta equals 1. You have to square root it, so you get secant theta equals plus or minus 1. And secant is 1 over cosine, so cosine of theta equals plus or minus 1. So then on your unit circle, cosine is positive 1 here and negative 1 here. So then you'd have 2 pi n and pi plus 2 pi n as your answers. First, you'd add 5 to the other side, so you get cosine squared of theta equals 2, and then you divide by 8 to get the cosine squared by itself, so then you get 1/4, and then you have to square root it to get rid of the square, so you get cosine of theta equals plus or minus 1/2, and then on your unit circle, those would be 60-degree angles, but since there's a domain restriction, it can't be in the first quadrant, so that leaves you with your 60-degree angles. And your answers would be 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and 5 pi over 3 are your answers. For this one, you'd first start off by subtracting 4 root 3, so you get 3 root 3 tangent squared of theta equals root 3, and then you divide by root 3, so you get tangent squared of theta equals root 3 divided by 3 root 3, and the root 3's cancel, so then you get tangent squared of theta equals 1 over 3, and then you have to square root that to get rid of the square, so you get tangent of theta equals plus or minus 1 over root 3. Tangent is sine over cosine, so then that means that tangent theta equals plus or minus 1/2 over root 3 over 2. So then, on your unit circle, because the domain restriction is that, cannot have be anything on the top. So then, you'd end up with your 30-degree angles, which makes cosine 1/2, and that would be 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6 as your answers.